The scroll arrived without ceremony, unmarked, unsigned, and handed to Lucius Quietus by a courier who refused eye contact. Inside only a single sentence in flawless Latin: "Return to Rome." You are summoned. At first glance it looked like an honor. Quietus had spent years commanding legions in the eastern provinces, putting down revolts, purging dissent, and turning deserts red in the name of imperial order. His brutal suppression of the Jewish uprisings during the Quietus War had made him infamous, but in Rome his reputation had always been something stranger, both lionized and loathed. The problem was that Quietus wasn't Roman. Born in Mauritania to a Berber family and trained in Roman doctrine, Lucius was an outsider molded into a weapon. He didn't ascend through bloodlines or Senate connections, but through carnage. The Senate had once applauded him as a hero. Now they could barely bring themselves to say his name. As he crossed the city gates of Rome under the shadow of the aqueducts, he sensed the shift. No parades, no fanfare, no statues draped in laurel. The few who recognized him did so with narrowed eyes. He was the kind of man whose victories reminded Rome of the savagery it needed to survive, and the kind of man it would later pretend never existed. The summons had come from Emperor Hadrian himself, Lucius's former sponsor and friend. Their paths had diverged after the Judean campaign. Hadrian had risen through charm intellect and political maneuvering. Quietus had risen through fear. Their reunion was private. No records would mention what passed between them, but several accounts describe Hadrian pacing, while Lucius remained still armored and unreadable. "You've made too many widows," Hadrian reportedly muttered. Quietus didn't respond. "You've made Rome remember what it wants to forget." A pause. Then softly, "You were never supposed to survive this long." That was the first hint. The honorific recall wasn't about celebration. It was containment. And Quietus, despite his record of obedience, had become dangerous because the empire had no script for what to do with a monster once it no longer needed one. Still, the execution wasn't immediate. Rome was far more sophisticated than that. First came the stripping of power. Quietus's command was quietly dissolved. His soldiers reassigned his estate held for review. His name was removed from public monuments. Rumors circulated that he had become unstable, even mad. One senator, Publius Arruntius, referred to him publicly as our Moorish Marius with a shorter expiration date. Then came the whispers that Quietus had taken trophies from his campaigns, that he had personally overseen the skinning of rebel priests that he had once eaten flesh during a siege. None of this was proven. None of it had to be. The goal was not conviction, it was revulsion. But Rome wasn't content to merely exile him. Quietus had become too symbolic. A living reminder that its frontiers were kept intact, not by virtue, but by horror. When Hadrian began purging rivals under the guise of moral reform, Quietus became the perfect scapegoat. He was foreign, he was brutal, and most importantly, he was alone. His officers were scattered. His political allies had vanished. Even his household slaves had been sold off their tongues, removed to prevent testimony. At night, Quietus wandered the gardens of his confiscated villa where his every movement was now watched by soldiers in plain clothes. He once stood at the edge of the fountain and muttered to a fig tree, "They made me into this, but now it's me they're afraid of." That line would later be carved anonymously into the wall of a barracks in Gaul. It became a kind of cursed proverb, and then the final blow. A new decree was issued not by Hadrian directly, but by a coalition of senators. Lucius Quietus was to stand trial for crimes against the dignity of the Roman people. Not for rebellion, not for treason, for inhuman excess in the pursuit of order. It was the most theatrical of charges, but Quietus said nothing. He didn't protest, didn't flee. He walked into the Curia Julia for his arraignment in full ceremonial armor, the same blood-stained cape he had worn during his final campaign, still clinging to his shoulders. It was not defiance, it was reminder. As he stood beneath the painted dome surrounded by senators who had once toasted his victories, the silence was thick with contradiction. Here was a man punished for being exactly who they had asked him to be, and yet no one met his gaze, because something was different this time. Quietus was not just a general. He had become a mirror, and Rome had begun to see its own reflection. The trial of Lucius Quietus was never truly a matter of law. It was theater designed not to convict a man, but to bury a legacy, and in this performance, every actor had something personal to avenge. At first, the courtroom was arranged with the usual decorum crimson-robed senators, marble busts, overhead guards standing rigid along the walls. But the witnesses called forth weren't the typical roster of patricians or military defectors. They were survivors, well-dressed men with Judean accents, Roman citizens by legal fiction, but culturally and spiritually distant from the imperial core. They spoke not of strategy or policy, but of atrocity. One merchant, once a resident of Lydda, told the Senate that he watched his 2 sons impaled and hoisted upside down from olive trees. Another claimed Quietus ordered priests to be sewn into the bellies of dead horses and left for the desert jackals. When asked for evidence, they brought forth scraps, rings pulled from burned corpses, broken temple tiles, smeared with soot, and one torn scroll bearing a Hebrew benediction allegedly found wrapped around a severed hand. These were not legal documents. They were relics, and the senators did not object. In truth, most of them had never cared about what had happened in Judea. Until now. Because behind the grief stood influence, particularly in the form of Gaius Sulpicius Severus, a powerful senator whose niece had married into a Jewish merchant clan. His interest was not justice, it was control. Quietus's rise had unsettled the order of things. A provincial general of Moorish blood untouched by tradition had carved a path through centuries of senatorial privilege. His removal was about restoring gravity, reminding the empire that no one, no matter how many revolts they crushed, could outshine the old aristocracy. But there was another darker undercurrent at play. The growing Christian minority had begun whispering that Quietus was the beast of the East sent to punish God's chosen. Apocalyptic pamphlets were distributed in alleyways painting him not as a man but as a demon draped in Roman armor. In one particularly striking scene, a prosecutor theatrically unrolled a diagram, an anatomical rendering of a man flayed alive supposedly drawn from Persian punishment manuals. He held it aloft for the Senate to see and declared, "This is the kind of art Quietus would commission, if not for display, then for inspiration." The gallery murmured. The diagram was entirely speculative, but that wasn't the point. It made the senators feel something. Quietus sat in silence throughout. When asked to respond, he raised his eyes and said, "Only this I did what Rome ordered. I did it well." Those words became a fracture line. Because what did it mean when obedience produced atrocity? What followed was a parade of contradictions. Military records were redacted. Campaign medals vanished from archives. One former officer who had once sworn allegiance to Quietus at the walls of Alexandria stood up in the courtroom and denied ever knowing him. But not everyone was willing to lie. A young tribune, visibly trembling, spoke of how Quietus once ordered an entire village spared after a child offered him figs. The man broke into tears, describing how Quietus wept silently during a siege, watching his men burn a synagogue against his explicit orders. He was not a monster, the tribune said. He was used like one. The testimony was struck from the record, yet what lingered most wasn't testimony at all. It was a pause. During the 3rd day of the trial, the courtroom fell into silence. Not a dramatic silence, but a slow, creeping one. It began with a poorly timed cough, then a whisper. Then the realization everyone had stopped speaking at once. Quietus was staring at something. Not the prosecutors, not the gallery, but the statue of Mars at the far end of the hall. Witnesses would later describe the look in his eyes as unreadable or tranquil. One scribe swore he saw a flicker of amusement, like a man watching a fire spread toward people who had lit it. It was in that silence that Senator Severus rose and introduced a final motion, an amendment to the punishment. Let the sentence, he said, fit not merely the crime, but the fear he has caused. Let his body confess what his tongue conceals. There was no applause, only a slow series of nods. The next morning, a new decree was posted across the forum. Lucius Quietus was to be executed in the manner of Eastern heretics, stripped of skin in full view of the people. The language was clinical, almost bored. But something was different this time. Rome had rarely used flaying as execution. It was a foreign practice, Persian, Parthian, even Dacian, but never truly Roman. Now the city was making an exception. Not for justice, but for a message. That afternoon, 2 slaves delivered a basket to Quietus's holding cell. Inside was a fresh robe dyed imperial purple and a mirror. No explanation was given, but the message was clear. This would not be a death. It would be a reflection. And Rome was preparing to flay not just a man, but its own illusion of mercy. It was supposed to end with a sentence. But what followed the decree was stranger than death. It was erasure, not merely of Lucius Quietus the man, but of everything he symbolized. And it began with language. The day after his punishment was announced, Quietus was brought not to a dungeon, but to the Temple of Concord, a space typically reserved for sacred arbitration, not execution logistics. There a peculiar tribunal assembled not senators, not generals, but philosophers, rhetoricians, and 2 former augurs stripped of rank. It looked more like a symposium than a court. The first to speak was Marcus Claudius Crispus, a Stoic, famed for his public lectures on just cruelty. He stood before Quietus and declared that the flaying would be a purification, not a punishment. That Quietus, by embodying Rome's darkest instincts, was offered a gift to die not as a man, but as a symbol. The others nodded solemnly, like priests explaining a mystery rite. Quietus did not reply. The silence unnerved them. One sophist muttered that the general had crossed into the space beyond speech, where men become beasts or gods. They debated this for an hour. Eventually they reached consensus. Quietus was to be preconditioned, not physically but linguistically. The execution would be meaningless if he retained control over his own narrative. And so they began stripping him of language. His guards were instructed to speak only in riddles. Orders were given through symbols. His meals were delivered without comment. His name was no longer spoken. The guards began referring to him only as Ile, that one. Then came the drugs. He was not sedated in the traditional sense. Instead, a slow regimen of sacred herbs and psychoactive fumes drawn from Egyptian funerary rites was introduced into his cell. These weren't meant to pacify, but to distort time, blur identity, and soften resistance. On the 5th day, he was visited by a boy, 12 years old, hair shorn, clad in priestly linen. The child sat across from Quietus and began chanting lines from a forgotten tragedy, Thyestes perhaps, or a lost Bacchic hymn. Every word was delivered in a voice just above a whisper. It was a re-education of sorts. The boy did not blink once. Later that night, Quietus carved a single line into the stone bench with a broken fingernail. "They are peeling me already." This line was discovered by a cleaning slave and secretly recorded. It circulated among underground soldiers like scripture. Meanwhile, the Senate was already preparing the square. Flaying was not a Roman tradition, so they borrowed from what little they knew of the East. Persian execution manuals were studied. A dissectionist from Alexandria was summoned. The executioners practiced on pigs and goats, learning how to keep the body alive for as long as possible without nicking a vein. They called these the rehearsals. Even the scaffold was redesigned. No longer a platform of simple height and rope, it became a stage circular, raised and surrounded by painted panels, depicting Quietus's campaigns now rendered grotesque. One mural showed him feeding children to wolves. Another, entirely invented, depicted him drinking blood from a soldier's helmet. It wasn't truth. It was anti-legend. And at the center stood a single marble post. They called it the Pillar of Reversal. Back in his cell, Quietus stopped speaking altogether. He no longer slept. He no longer blinked. One night, a guard claimed he whispered in a language no one recognized, possibly Punic or something even older. They brought in priests to confirm he wasn't possessed. He wasn't, he was remembering. Because Lucius Quietus, though educated in Latin, had grown up with Berber myths. And one of those myths told of a warrior who was skinned alive, and whose hide became a second soul roaming the wind, watching the descendants of his killers. The Romans didn't know this, but Quietus did. And now, facing the possibility that his flesh would outlive him, he no longer feared pain. He feared what would be done with his skin. One of the most disturbing moments came the night before the execution. Quietus, who had not moved for hours, suddenly stood and walked to the wall. He smeared his own blood onto the stone in the shape of an eye. No one stopped him. When asked what it meant, the attending guard could only shrug. But later a scholar suggested the symbol resembled the Eye of Tannet, a Carthaginian sigil believed to preserve vengeance across generations. Whether this was superstition or calculated defiance, it worked. The next morning, one of the executioners asked to be reassigned. Another vomited during rehearsal. Still, the show would go on. Rome had already invited the people. A public notice announced the event not as a punishment, but as a demonstration of the limits of loyalty. No name was used, only the phrase, "the Moor shall answer without tongue," Tickets were distributed to dignitaries. Bread and wine were ordered. A poet was commissioned to write an epilogue. Even the weather was consulted. If the sky rained, the date would be delayed. Quietus meanwhile sat beneath the temple of Concord, neither awake nor asleep. His breath shallow, his eyes dry, his back against the stone. And in that stillness something shifted. Not in him, but in Rome, because the city in trying to erase him had made something worse than a villain. It had made a myth it could no longer control. By the time dawn rose on the day of execution, Rome no longer felt like a city. It felt like a stage set for a pageant of cruelty, and every citizen, knowingly or not, had become part of the choreography. The square was transformed. Where once senators had given speeches and laws had been proclaimed, a towering ring of scaffolding now loomed encasing a platform of polished stone. Crimson banners fluttered above, bearing no imperial seal, only a single stylized image, a man disintegrating into curls of flesh. It was neither portrait nor warning. It was design. This was not death. It was production. The architects of the execution had taken inspiration from Persian flayings, Egyptian embalming, and even Greek drama. A team of executioners renamed artifices craftsmen had trained for over a month. They had been drilled not just in precision but in pacing, timing, and symmetry. Their knives were honed to a whisper, their movements rehearsed to match music. Yes, there would be music. A flute and lyre ensemble had been hired to play an original composition in 4 movements, one for each stage of the flaying. Each note was meant to mimic either the rise of breath, the shudder of muscle, or the last twitch of a dying nerve. They called the piece the undoing of silence. The audience was handpicked. Senators, foreign envoys, military veterans, and even poets sat shoulder to shoulder. Everyone had a reason to watch. Some came for justice, others for politics. Most quietly came for catharsis. Quietus arrived at noon, not dragged, not shackled, but walking upright, calm. His robe, the imperial purple one they had mocked him with, dragged behind him like a burial cloth. He had not spoken for days, but now as the drums began to pound, he looked up at the crowd and whispered something no one could hear. One scribe later claimed it was, "Do not blink. I want you to see everything." They strapped him to the pillar of reversal. It was not a cross, not a stake, but a column fitted with mechanical levers designed to slowly rotate the body as the skin was removed. It allowed for equal access. It allowed for spectacle. The flaying began at the shoulders. The first cut was not deep, just enough to lift the edge of skin. An assistant held it with bronze tongs, while the primary artificer began the slow, downward motion. There was no blood spray, no screaming. The knives moved so precisely they slid between dermis and tissue like dancers slipping through a curtain. The crowd at first was quiet, but as the second movement of music began a slow, descending scale meant to mimic falling leaves, people began to murmur. Some leaned forward, others looked away. One senator wept without understanding why. Quietus did not struggle, he did not scream, but his body reacted. The muscles in his jaw trembled, his eyes watered. At one point his fingers twitched in rhythm with the lyre, as if he were playing the notes himself. Then came the face. This was no longer anatomical, this was theater. As the skin of the cheeks was lifted, a mask of red was revealed, bloodless, veined, glistening. The craftsman had to pause. Not for medical reasons, but because the audience had begun to hum. Not in horror, but in something closer to awe. A child vomited. A woman fainted. A veteran clutched his gladius until his palm bled. And yet no one left. Each time the knives returned to Quietus's chest, the air grew heavier. The third movement of music rose now, mimicking thunder. The artificers worked in tandem like a duet, one peeling, one holding, one pausing to dab sweat from Quietus's brow. And still he did not scream. But then came a moment that would be recorded in over a dozen scrolls. As the executioners reached his abdomen, Quietus tilted his head toward the crowd, and with effort formed a shape with his lips. Not a word. A name. Hadrian. Only one person noticed. A minor court poet named Varius Felix. He wrote in his journal that night, "In that moment the flaying ceased to be punishment. It became testimony." The fourth and final movement of music began a hollow, broken sequence of single notes, meant to mimic the fading of breath. Quietus was still alive. Barely. His chest heaved, but his eyes remained open. They would stay open for nearly 7 minutes after the final strip of skin was removed. 7 minutes. No one spoke. No one cheered. The artificers lowered the body, not to bury it, but to begin the second phase. For while the crowd assumed the horror had ended, they were mistaken. Because Rome had not just planned a death, it had planned a transformation. The flayed skin of Lucius Quietus was not discarded. It was soaked in wine, stretched across a wooden frame, and left to dry in the sun right there in the square. A priest read a eulogy over it. A general saluted it. A herald declared it an artifact of civic correction. Only one voice in the crowd dared speak out, a Judean elder who simply asked, "Is this justice or imitation?" No one answered him, because something was different this time. Rome had always killed, but now it had curated death. And Quietus, unflinching to the end, had become more than a man without skin. He had become a mirror none of them could look away from. The square emptied slowly, too slowly. Long after Quietus's body had been removed and his flayed skin pinned up like a war trophy, the people remained. Not as celebrants, not even as citizens, but as witnesses, unable to process what they had just seen. By sunset, the musicians had packed away their instruments. The artificers had retreated to a guarded compound. Senators had returned to their villas, and yet 1,000 onlookers still circled the scaffold, their faces blank as if under hypnosis. Some knelt. Others muttered prayers. Several simply stared at the drying skin, mesmerized by how it changed hue as the light faded. Rome had always thrived on spectacle, but this was something else. The people weren't entertained. They were transfixed. Guards attempted to disperse the crowd by nightfall. They announced that the ceremony was concluded. Bread rations were withdrawn. Wine vendors were ordered to pack up. But the crowd wouldn't go. A veteran centurion shouted that he'd fought under Quietus in Judea, and that the general had once carried a wounded soldier on his back for 3 miles. Others hushed him, not because they disbelieved him, but because the story made the moment worse. More people arrived as darkness settled, some out of curiosity, others out of rumor. Torches were lit. Parents whispered to their children that they were looking upon the death of a monster, even as their own eyes remained fixed on the flayed form with a kind of helpless awe. And then someone began to chant. It wasn't a Roman song. It wasn't even Latin. It was Berber. A low, rhythmic incantation, likely meaningless to most present, but unmistakably mournful. A woman picked it up next, then a boy. Within minutes, dozens were humming the same strange foreign cadence. A sound that didn't belong in the capital of the empire, but echoed through its marble corridors like ancestral thunder. One tribune, deeply disturbed, ordered the guards to silence the chanters. But none of them moved. They stood with their hands clenched, unsure whether suppressing a funeral dirge would appear just or weak, because something primal had awakened in the crowd. They weren't just watching, they were grieving. And worse, they didn't know why. Some whispered that Quietus had absorbed the sins of the empire. Others claimed his skin now bore the names of every rebel he had killed, an illusion caused by drying blood. One woman swore that the hide had twitched. A boy fainted after saying the eye carved into the wall of Quietus's cell had reappeared beneath the scaffold, staring up at the Senate balcony. By midnight, torches burned low, but still they stayed. In one corner of the square, a scribe began taking testimonies not of the flaying, but of the emotions it had stirred. One man confessed he had supported the punishment, but now felt hollow. A midwife said she dreamed of her child screaming inside the pillar. A merchant admitted he had been aroused by the spectacle and was now sick with shame. Rome had not prepared for this. It had orchestrated a punishment, and what it had created was a collective trauma. Even the guards began to falter. One confessed in a whisper, "I felt like we were watching the gods turn on themselves." A strange scent lingered in the air, not rot, not blood. Something more metallic, like heated coins and old bronze. Some said it was the scent of truth. Others said it was just the iron stench of regret. The Senate, alarmed by the immobility of the crowd, convened an emergency session at dawn. Several senators demanded that the hide be removed and burned immediately. Others argued that would make a martyr of Quietus. One senator, a junior from Hispania, simply asked, "What if we already have?" That morning, a new order was issued. The skin was to be removed from the square. Not destroyed, but preserved. officially as a civic artifact of deterrence, unofficially because no one dared touch it with fire. Even as soldiers climbed the scaffold to lower the frame, the crowd flinched in unison as if watching a second execution. A few wept. One older man collapsed and died of what would later be described as emotional rupture. When the skin was finally removed, the chanting stopped, but the silence that replaced it was heavier. Rome had not expected a reaction this deep, this contagious. The execution was meant to terrify. Instead, it infected. The word spread far beyond the capital. In Gaul, soldiers began refusing to wear purple sashes, fearing they'd be mistaken for tyrants. In Alexandria, a student carved the phrase, "Do not blink. I want you to see everything into a university pillar where it remains today." And in Judea, of all places, an underground sect began holding vigils, not for the man they once called Butcher, but for what his death revealed. Because something was different this time. This was not the story of Rome destroying a traitor. This was the story of Rome punishing a reflection. And in doing so, it forced the people to look. And once they had looked, they could not unsee. They dried it with wine, not as a mercy, as a preservative. Lucius Quietus's flayed skin, once stretched across a blood-soaked frame in the Forum, was now considered a state relic. Not buried, not burned, but carefully processed, oiled, perfumed, and stitched at the seams like a sacred garment. Rome had turned it into a trophy. The artisans who had performed the execution were now repurposed as curators. Under order of the Senate, they sealed the hide in a glass case reinforced with bronze studs. The label beneath it read only Remedium Superbiae, remedy for arrogance. But it didn't stay in the Forum. Instead, it traveled. First to the Castra Praetoria, the military barracks of the Praetorian Guard, where it was displayed before raw recruits. The idea was clear: disobey, and this is your fate. Yet within a week, the guards refused to sleep near it. One claimed he heard whispers. Another was found praying before it. A third deserted. So it was moved, next to a minor temple on the outskirts of Rome, repurposed as a memorial to civic order. A philosopher gave weekly lectures beneath it, but soon the crowds stopped coming. Not out of protest, but out of discomfort. They couldn't stand the way the light hit the skin, how the seams looked too much like veins, the way the dried eye sockets stared back accusingly. Then came the dream reports. Multiple senators reported night visions. Some saw Quietus marching through fire. Others saw him sitting at the Senate floor, skinless, smiling. One claimed he saw the hide stitched onto a statue of Mars, as if the god himself had worn it like armor. Another said the skin whispered Latin backwards. All nonsense officially. But privately, Hadrian was alarmed. Not because he believed in curses, but because for the first time he realized Rome had created an unkillable symbol, and it was starting to mutate. Because skin, unlike marble or iron, is human. It stains, it smells, it decays. But it also persists in ways stone does not. Unlike a statue, Quietus's hide could not be reinterpreted. It was not myth, it was fact. Undeniable, grotesque, and physical. That made it powerful. Whispers began circulating across the provinces. In Germania, soldiers told stories of a general who survived his execution by casting his soul into his flesh. In Numidia, children dared each other to say Quietus's name aloud at night. In Judea, some began calling him Al-Adhab the Tormentor, yet not always with hatred, sometimes with awe. The skin had become a symbol, but not the one Rome had wanted. Instead of fear, it evoked fixation. Instead of obedience, discomfort. It was passed from garrison to temple, always under some new justification, a teaching tool, a deterrent, a political artifact. But no one wanted to keep it for long. Eventually, it was sent to the eastern frontier, to the city of Antioch, where Roman control was always brittle. There it was displayed in the war council hall, nailed to a wooden frame. The local governor ordered his soldiers to pass it every morning, saluting as they went. But then the disappearances began. 2 guards vanished. One scholar who tried to transcribe the ancient scar patterns threw himself into the Orontes River days later. A Syrian priest claimed to see steam rising from the hide at night. He was executed for sedition, but the tale endured. A new order was quietly dispatched from Rome. Preserve the relic, but do not display it. So it was sealed in a sarcophagus beneath a temple crypt. But even there it lived. Years later, during a flood, the temple was briefly opened for shelter. Survivors claimed a strange odor filled the chamber copper and smoke. A child described seeing a face in the stone weeping red. None of it was confirmed, but rumors of the hide's location became myth, and myth became pilgrimage. Rome tried to deny it. Scrolls referencing Quietus were burned. His name was removed from surviving military records. But the harder they scrubbed, the more persistent the stain became, because unlike statues which glorify or coins which circulate, this was something else. The skin didn't celebrate empire, it confronted it, and it was tactile. You could see the scar where he had been stabbed in Judea, the stretched shoulder where he had carried wounded men, the missing patch where an executioner slipped and took muscle with flesh. Each part told a story, not one of defiance or of villainy, but of cost. Rome had tried to craft a warning. Instead, it had made a memorial, not to rebellion, but to contradiction. One that said, here is what we do to our loyal monsters. Here is what loyalty earns when it frightens power. Here is what truth looks like, when it bleeds. And in that lesson, buried beneath its most public shame, Rome revealed something it had never meant to show. Its skin. The emperor did not attend the execution, at least not publicly. Hadrian, by that point, had perfected the art of being seen as absent while being everywhere. On the day Lucius Quietus was flayed, he secluded himself at his villa in Tibur, an enormous complex of palaces, libraries, and artificial canals built to project divine detachment. But even from that distance, he saw everything, not through letters, through silence. His advisors returned from the city, pale and quiet. The crowd had not cheered. The Senate, after years of brash certainty, was suddenly avoiding eye contact. And worse, Hadrian's name had been whispered on the lips of a dying man whose skin would now outlive the empire itself. For days the emperor refused audiences. Instead, he wandered his villa in solitude, sometimes standing before the mirror-lined walls of the triclinium, where his own face reflected back at him in 100 fractured angles. He ate alone. He dictated nothing. Aides found discarded drafts of imperial letters, one that read simply, "I made him." That was the wound he couldn't close. Because Hadrian had raised Quietus, not like a son, like a weapon. He had plucked the Moor from obscurity, recognized the precision in his brutality, and handed him Rome's darkest tasks. The suppression of the Judean revolt, the scorched pacification of Cyrenaica. Each assignment was unwinnable. Each victory required the kind of violence the Senate refused to acknowledge, but demanded behind closed doors. And Quietus delivered. Too well. So well that Hadrian had grown afraid. Because in Quietus he saw the ideal Roman officer, unflinching, foreign, necessary, disposable. A man who did what needed doing so the emperors could speak of peace. But once the peace was secure, the memory of the violence became inconvenient. And so he had signed the order. Not just for removal, but for unmaking. In one version of events recorded in a marginal note by a court slave, Hadrian stood before a sculpture of Mars in his garden and asked aloud, "When you murder your own sword, what becomes of the hand that held it?" That same day, he ordered a replica of the Pillar of Reversal constructed in miniature. No one knew why. It stood in a private chamber surrounded by no inscription, no context, just a tall, polished post of marble streaked with red veins that weren't there when it was quarried. Hadrian stared at it for hours. He began refusing sleep. He developed a habit of tracing the curve of his own arms, as if imagining what would happen if someone peeled them back. One night, he ordered a mirror placed beside his bed facing him as he drifted off. He wanted to see himself, but not the face, the skin, because that's what haunted him now. Not Quietus's silence, not even the flaying, the skin, the knowledge that Rome had preserved it, that somewhere in some temple crypt or locked vault the body of his guilt remained. Not buried, not forgiven, just waiting. Waiting to be remembered. He issued secret orders to locate and destroy it. They failed. The relic had vanished, moved, hidden, perhaps even stolen. Some whispered it had been taken east beyond the empire's reach. Others claimed it was burned in secret and replaced with a forgery to avoid blame. But Hadrian wasn't worried about the object itself. He was worried about the idea, because the skin of Quietus had become a lens through which Rome saw itself not as a beacon of civilization, but as a creature of calculation, of hygiene murders and polished cruelty, a place where even loyalty could become a death sentence if it reminded the empire of its methods. Hadrian tried to reverse course. He commissioned a new statue of a nameless soldier, depicted not in triumph, but in sorrow. It stood without armor, without weapons. The inscription read, "Obedience without memory." Few understood it. Fewer visited it. But Hadrian would sit beneath it for hours. He stopped attending Senate sessions. He began composing letters to unknown recipients, addressed not to emperors or officials, but to abstractions to the future, to the one who sees, to the man who survives me. One reads, "I killed a reflection. It didn't shatter. It stared back." And in this spiral of reflection, Hadrian began to fade. Physically, yes, he grew sick, weakened, withdrawn. But more dangerously morally. He no longer trusted the machinery he had once commanded. Every new general felt like a future Quietus. Every law, a future confession. In one final documented act, he issued a private veto to block the execution of a scribe accused of sedition. His note simply read, "No more mirrors." Because something was different this time. Hadrian had not destroyed a traitor. He had dismantled a man he built, and in doing so discovered that power does not shield you from responsibility. It makes you its curator. And in that role, you do not choose what survives, only what haunts. Years passed. Rome changed. Emperors rose and fell. Borders shifted, temples crumbled, and statues were recarved to match new names. But the story of Lucius Quietus the general, flayed alive in full view of the empire, never faded. Because he had become more than a man. He had become an interruption, not just to Roman history, but to its narrative. The one Rome told about itself of disciplined justice and enlightened brutality. Quietus was the seam that came undone. The one moment the empire punished its own reflection and then tried frantically to sew the skin back in place. But the stitches never held. Fragments of the story drifted across centuries like spores. A mosaic in Ostia depicts a man with no face arms bound surrounded by flames, though no text explains who he is. In Carthage, a funerary plaque was found with the phrase "to the skinless one who spoke without tongue." Even in distant Britannia, a scratched line in a Roman barracks reads, "I saw the flaying. I blinked. I still see." And then came the copycats. In the city of Tyre, a condemned soldier attempted to reenact the execution in reverse, stripping his own skin in protest. He died screaming, but not before carving a single word into the dirt beside him. Lucius. In Ephesus, a cult emerged calling themselves the Veiled. They wrapped their faces in linen and wandered the streets in silence. When questioned, they claimed they were waiting for the return of the man whose body had no face, only truth. Rome declared them heretics. The cult persisted for another 30 years, and still no one knew where the skin had gone. Hadrian died full of uncertainty, and ulcers never having located the relic. His successors ignored it, then denied it, then quietly warned about its mention in official records. One decree simply stated, "Speak not of the general." That was not our Rome, but it was. And everyone knew it. Because the true horror wasn't the flaying. It wasn't even the ritualized nature of the execution. It was the recognition that Quietus had done nothing wrong, that he had followed orders, that his undoing was a matter of optics, not justice. And once Rome understood that, truly viscerally it cracked. A kind of imperial neurosis set in. Future executions were staged with increasing restraint. Public floggings gave way to private poisonings. Death became less about display and more about containment, as if the empire had touched something too deep and now feared what else might surface. Historians writing centuries later still argued over Quietus. Some called him a martyr, others a butcher rightly destroyed. But none could deny the impact of his death, because it marked a shift from the old Rome of conquest and spectacle to the paranoid Rome of mirrors, whispers, and invisible knives. And still the stories circulated. That the skin had been hidden beneath the Vatican Hill. That it had been worn by a mad emperor in secret ceremonies. That it had been sewn into the lining of a general's standard, carried into battle, staining victory with dread. None of these tales could be confirmed, but none were disbelieved either, because something was different this time. Lucius Quietus did not die in the shadows. He did not vanish into rumor. He died under Rome's full light while the empire tried to convince itself it was cleansing sin. Instead, it immortalized it. And centuries later, in dark rooms when senators considered betrayal, generals weighed rebellion, or citizens muttered about justice, they thought of the man who had been flayed not because he failed Rome, but because he had succeeded too well, and in that success had shown the empire not what it could become, but what it already was. Time wears down empires. It erodes stones, silences, voices dulls even the most sharpened legends. But not all scars fade. Some remain beneath the surface tender, waiting ready to ache when pressed. The execution of Lucius Quietus is one of those scars. What does it mean after all when a state punishes its own loyalty? Quietus was no rebel. He obeyed, delivered, performed with brutal precision the very tasks his superiors handed him. He fought for order, for Rome's illusion of stability. And when the blood dried and the rebellions quieted, the empire turned to him, not to thank him, but to unmake him. Not because he was dangerous, because he was unforgettable. Quietus represented what Rome desperately wanted to deny, that its grandeur required cruelty, that its peace was built not on virtue but on fear, that the hands that held the sword were often forced to bleed so that others could sleep in clean beds and speak of civilization. His death was a performance, yes, but not just for the crowd. It was for the conscience of an empire. To flay a man alive in public is not merely execution. It is confession. Rome showed its people not what it would do to enemies, but what it would do to those who made it uncomfortable. To those who served too well, killed too efficiently, mirrored power too closely. And centuries later, what lingers isn't the method. It's the meaning. It is the question left behind. When does loyalty become liability? When does obedience threaten the throne? When the skin of a man becomes more dangerous than the man himself? What does that say about the system that wears it? Lucius Quietus was flayed to be forgotten. But instead he became something far more unsettling. A ghost in the Roman mind. Not the ghost of a man, the ghost of a truth.